This is baby Torsten crying. He is crying because he is a baby, but he's also crying because he does not have his mother. Torsten was born in East Berlin, Germany in January 1961. He was born with birth defects which could only be treated in West Berlin. His mother brought Torsten to a West Berlin hospital for treatment and returned to her East Berlin home. That night, the city of Berlin became divided. Roads were closed, barbed wire was laid, and army troops prevented movement between the east and west sides of the city. Mother became immediately separated from her newborn child. She was able to visit her baby a few times, but as a physical wall rose to divide Berlin, she lost contact with her child for the next 4 years. The Berlin Wall physically divided the city, and it also divided the Berlin society for 30 years. When the wall fell, the East Berlin citizens needed to overcome new barriers of greater economic and emotional hardship. It was May 8, 1945, and World War II had come to a close. Berlin was separated by Allied powers, the Soviet Union in the east part of the city, and America, the United Kingdom, and France in the west. Many East Berliners had very little freedom under the Soviets, so they escaped to the west side, and eventually the Soviets lost almost 15% of the population in East Berlin. Starting on October 29, 1946, you needed an interzone pass to get from East to West Berlin. Over the next few years, East Berlin started becoming different from West Berlin. The government changed to a communist style, which immediately stopped the free economy and restricted the lifestyle of the East Berlin society. Then on August 13, 1961, physical barriers were built to stop the movement between East and West Berlin. The East Berlin government coordinated the building of the wall over the objections of West Berlin. Researchers still have not figured out who ordered the wall to be built, but they have narrowed it down to two people. One is the East German leader, Walter Ulbricht. Ulbricht was the leader of the German Communist Party, and before the wall went up, he had many meetings about the construction. So if he was having meetings about construction, he was likely in charge of creating the wall. Khrushchev wanted to divide East and West with barbed wire without a wall. He was the leader of the Soviet Union, and they went to Nikita to approve the construction of the wall. Nikita approved the construction, and they began building. Originally, the Berlin Wall was not very long distance, but after escapes, they added onto it. The wall was made out of concrete and was 15 feet tall. The wall had barbed wire, watchtowers, and machine gun emplacements. Toward the beginning, East Berliners could escape easily, but over time the security got stronger. Throughout all the wall's existence, only 5,000 people managed to escape. 5,000 may sound like a big number of people, but compared to the population being roughly 1 million people, it is not a lot. The GDR were the guards at the Berlin Wall, and there were about 10,000 guards watching the wall all day and night. As the wall divided the city, more and more differences between the two sides were created. The main differences centered on the two very different governments and economies. The east side was communist. The goal of communism is that everyone has the same income, food provided for them, and the basic essentials of life given to them. The East Berlin government, under Walter Ulbricht, tried to implement communism by controlling information given to the public and by keeping everything basic with no luxuries. So, in the East, individual freedoms were restricted and the economy was managed by the government. The west side of Berlin, under the leadership of Heinrich Lübke, was capitalist. This means that they had a lot more freedom compared to the east side. For example, the people who lived on the west side had more freedom when it came to choosing a job. In an interview with an unnamed West Berliner, she states that her life really did not change much because her freedoms were not restricted and she was not able to seek any job she wanted. The unnamed person also said that West Berlin was highly dependent on the Allies to protect these freedoms. All the Allies supported West Germany, and specifically West Berlin. In fact, President John F. Kennedy once visited West Berlin and said his famous phrase of Ich bin ein Berliner.
Ich bin ein Berliner.
That translates to I am a Berliner. President Kennedy shared the Allied view that West Berlin represented the Allied vision of freedom and democracy. Of course, the Soviet Union, who controlled East Berlin, disagreed. They rejected the Allied views and tried to implement a communist vision of economic and societal equality. This practically resulted in the West having more exposure to the world and more economic success. The East, on the other hand, struggled to provide basic necessities to its citizens and did not have any exposure to the outside world.
The wall also affected the two sides socially and emotionally. One example is that many families were split apart. Baby Torsten is a prime example of families being torn apart. Torsten was separated from his mother, Sigrid Paul, from birth for 4 years. Sigrid Paul stated that during those 4 years she wondered what he looked like, if he could talk. I can't put that kind of longing into words. These separations created large emotional tolls on families from both sides of the city. During all this tension between East and West Berlin, it was the middle of the Cold War. The Cold War was a war between the United States and its allies from World War II and the Soviet Union. It was from 1947 to 1991, but it started to end around 1989. It was based on political, economic, and propaganda fronts. It was between two war powerhouses, which had access to many strong military weapons. If any of the two countries used weapons, millions of people can be wiped out within seconds. It started a little after the Nazis surrendered in World War II, and the Allies won. By 1948, the Soviets installed governments in the countries of Eastern Europe. The Americans and Britain feared that there would be permanent domination in Eastern Europe and communism going into Western Europe. It was a political war, and the two sides used their powerful weapons as threats. The Cold War ended in the late 1980s because of the lessening of communism's effect in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. The end of the Cold War signified two very important historical topics. First of all, the Cold War ended the big dispute between the U.S. and the USSR. These two countries had been enemies ever since World War II. Because of the Cold War ending, the two could finally be at peace. This helped put less stress on both countries because there had been nuclear bomb threats from both countries. The second thing the Cold War signifies is that the war can take place without any soldiers. The Cold War was fought by political actions and propaganda, not by soldiers. The collapse of the Cold War allowed the collapse of the Berlin Wall. On November 9, 1989, the head of the East German Communist Party announced a complete opening of the border between East and West Berlin. Berliners from both sides began to tear down the wall and became united as one city. The fall of the Berlin Wall was able to bring families and friends back together. They had many interviews with reunited families, and many of them just had no comments. They were just so grateful to be able to hug their family members. After the wall came down, communism began to die. The Cold War was basically over and ended the rise of the Soviet Union. East Berliners also had to learn how to function in a free capital economy and society. All their lives, the communist government had provided their basic economic needs. Now they had to learn how to earn a living on their own. Lance Wallace, a United States reporter, interviewed East Berliners after the wall fell. Many East Berliners actually missed the Russians because they, at least, had security with them. They didn't have to worry about losing their jobs or not being able to pay their rent. Now, with their new freedom, they had trouble learning how to provide for their families. They needed to learn how to overcome these new economic barriers so they could live in the new Western world. The rise of the Berlin Wall divided a city and created two different societies. When the wall fell and the two societies came together, the East Berlin people had greater economic and emotional barriers to overcome than the Western co-citizens. In the end, however, as all the Berlin and Germany became free, the East Berliners overcame these barriers. They learned how to be free individuals and work together as one city and one country.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.